Investigators seek a serial bomber whose targets crisscross New York State. 4 deadly explosions in 90 minutes leave only vague clues to the bomber's identity. Detectives in Florida rush to the scene of a massive explosion at a lavish estate. Somewhere in the twisted wreckage lie clues that will lead them to the killer. Bomb investigators must piece together the shattered remains of an intricate puzzle. Every long and grueling bombing investigation begins with a short fuse. Eleanor Fowler of West Valley, New York, had no idea the phone call she received a few days after Christmas in 1993 would be a prelude to death. A delivery service asked for directions to her house so they could deliver a package. Suspicious, Eleanor called the police. They told her anonymous packages aren't a crime, and there was nothing they could do. Eleanor accepted the box with reluctance. She cut into it and removed the crumpled newspaper. Inside, she found a toolbox. Whoever sent it didn't include a note. She flipped the latch and lifted the lid, triggering a fatal explosion. Eleanor Fowler was the first victim in what was to become a statewide serial bombing. 5 more bombs, concealed inside identical toolboxes, were delivered throughout northern and western New York within 90 minutes. 4 of the bombs exploded, killing 5 and injuring 2. Investigators from 3 New York offices of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, along with their national response team, followed the trail of explosions to each bomb site. The ATF is the federal agency assigned to investigate bombings. Special Agent Scott Sammis of the Rochester Bureau of the ATF was one of the first agents to respond.
The investigation starts on December 28th, 1993, when I receive a phone call from my supervisor, who tells me to respond to Buffalo. He's had several bombings, possibly several deaths. Please come out there and assist. I'm in Rochester. I'm an hour and a half away. He then calls me back a few minutes later and asks me to stay in Rochester because there's just been a detonation in Rochester with possibly some deaths there.
The 4 simultaneous bombings would stretch the limits of the ATF and other law enforcement agencies. At each scene, investigators' first task was to find every piece of evidence, no matter how small, no matter how inconsequential it looked. It was too soon to tell what might point them to the person who sent the deadly packages. Much of the evidence consisted of small fragments coated with explosive residue. To determine what kind of explosive was used, The evidence at each scene was bagged and sent to forensic chemist Doug Klapek at the ATF laboratories in Rockville, Maryland.
Well, in this case, we had to make sure that everything not only was stored separately up in Rochester, but was shipped separately down here. And different people were handling different parts of evidence. Even though things were already in airtight containers, we wanted to make sure that was the case.
As the lab processed the evidence, investigators tried to trace the packages. The bomber used local delivery services and the U.S. mail, making the parcels difficult to trace. Unaware of their deadly cargo, the unsuspecting drivers made their rounds. The packages, weighing about 16 pounds, looked harmless enough. How could the delivery people know they were laden with death? Not all the bombs reached their targets. When one driver tried to deliver a package to Corrections Officer Scott Kemp at the New York State Penitentiary, he learned Kemp wasn't working. The penitentiary couldn't accept the package. Aggravated at the delay it would cause him to redeliver it another time, he threw the box into the back of his van. Through sheer luck, the bomb didn't detonate. This bomb and another that malfunctioned were disarmed by the Erie County Sheriff's Bomb Squad.
Devices did not function.
They provided investigators with an important break in the case. They now could look at how the bombs were built.
Inside this device, after is tripped by opening it up, this would trip the device. Not doing the latch, but opening it up like this would trip the device, like that. That would cause the detonator to explode inside here and hit this about 4 pounds of dynamite. Also included inside of this device was about 11.5 pounds of shrapnel. And these shrapnel pieces were of 28 different varieties.
Propelled by the dynamite, each piece of shrapnel travels 10 times faster than a bullet. Moving at 14 to 15,000 feet per second, the shards can tear through solid concrete. Explosives are grouped in two categories: high explosives and low explosives. High explosives like dynamite and C4 are the most powerful. They are used commercially for demolition and excavation and for military applications. Very stable to work with, high explosives require a great amount of force, a detonator, to set them off. Low explosives include the flash powder used in firecrackers and smokeless powder used in shotgun shells. They're easier to ignite than high explosives and are the explosive of choice for amateur bombers. By looking at the degree of destruction at the New York bomb scenes, investigators knew immediately that it was caused by high explosives. James Crippen, a 9-year veteran with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, trains law enforcement agencies to conduct bomb investigations at the scene and in the lab. He's seen his share of the havoc wrought by high explosives.
Certainly a pound of C4 is going to do a whole lot more damage than a pound of black powder. You know, a pound of black powder, you know, make a pretty good bomb, but, you know, a pound of C4 will, you know, can devastate a building. I mean, you're talking a difference in detonation velocity of anywhere from 1,200 to maybe 1,800 feet per second for black powder to in the neighborhood of 25,000 feet per second for C4. So there's a lot more force involved, a lot more shattering force.
But sometimes people can survive a bomb blast, even from a high explosive. Roosevelt Town resident William Lazore was a target of the New York serial bomber, but his suspicion saved his life. When Lazor picked up his package from the post office, the clerk joked that it might be a bomb. Though the clerk was trying to be funny, Lazor was careful enough to open the toolbox with his rake. That added bit of distance and caution saved his life when the bomb exploded. Several hundred miles away in Cheektowaga, Robert Fowler was less fortunate. Eleanor Fowler's husband received his package at work. These pictures were taken from a surveillance camera that captures a still image every few seconds. They count down the final moments in the lives of Robert Fowler and his co-worker, John O'Donnell. Just before the explosion, another co-worker, Jeffrey Camp, offered to open the package with his pocket knife. The blast was so powerful, it threw Fowler some 15 feet down the hallway. Miraculously, Camp survived and can be seen fleeing the scene for help. 6 bombs, 4 explosions, 4 counties in New York State. Each unexploded bomb was nearly identical, packaged in a toolbox and mailed from Buffalo. The bombing shared another element. All the intended victims were related.
All the family members are interviewed. There were other family members who were not targeted, who were found and interviewed, and who survived. And everyone was asked, who do you think might have done this? And everybody said, well, Mike Stevens, maybe he did it.
56-year-old Mike Stevens had a girlfriend named Brenda Shavir. Everyone targeted in the bombing was related to Brenda. The connection might have been a coincidence, except for one more revealing detail. 3 months earlier, the Monroe County Sheriff's bomb squad told Sammis that a restaurant manager near Rochester found more than 100 sticks of dynamite near a dumpster. The code numbers on the dynamite matched the dynamite in the unexploded bombs. Investigators traced the numbers to the Kentucky Powder Company. The firm, housed in a quarry, sold blasting supplies. Employees gave Sammis a description of a man who had purchased 55 pounds of dynamite and 50 blasting caps 4 months earlier. Sammis's investigation revealed this man to be Earl Figley, a close friend of Mike Stevens. Sammis questioned Figley. Presented with all the evidence implicating him, Figley confessed that he and Stevens made the bombs and sent them to Brenda's family. Figley explained Stevens' motivation. Mike wanted to exact revenge on his girlfriend's family for not accepting him.
The relationship between the two started becoming strained, and Mike started tapping her phone calls. And just as in any relationship, your own family is going to support you in your relationship with another person. And that's what happened in this case. Things weren't going well. Family members of Brenda would tell her, if it's not working out, why don't you get out of the relationship?
Police had enough evidence to arrest both Earl Figley and Mike Stevens, but they still had to build a case that could not be beaten in court. For that, they needed hard evidence to convict Mike Stevens. In New York in 1994, detectives continued to follow every lead as they built their case against a serial bomber. While Mike Stevens and Earl Figley were in jail, the ATF National Response Team searched Figley's hotel room. They found boxes identical to the ones used to send the bombs. A tip led ATF agents and the Rochester Police Bomb Squad to a cache of evidence in a storage locker Stevens had rented several months earlier.
Uh-oh, here we go.
Inside the locker, police uncovered dynamite and blasting caps.
Got it, Madeline?
The explosives provided the ATF and other agencies with the ammunition they needed in their case against Stevens. But the incriminating evidence didn't stop with the explosives. They also recovered disguises Figley wore when he purchased equipment and mailed the bombs: a wig, beard, and theatrical makeup.
And a beard and a mustache.
They also found the books Stevens and Figley studied to learn how to construct the deadly weapons. The fact that these books exist represents the risk we take living in a free society, according to bomb expert James Crippen.
The information has always been around on how to build devices. That's one of the things that we live with in the United States, because we have a very rigid view of freedom of information, no matter how much trouble it's going to cause us down the road. And I certainly agree with that point of view that, you don't want to restrict information. You just hope that people will use it responsibly.
Besides the explosives and books found in storage, investigators also found tools in Stevens' home. And like most everything else used in a crime, tools can be traced. At the ATF laboratory in Rockville, Maryland, forensic investigators carefully studied wire cutters they found in Stevens' home. Toolmark specialists had to match the wire cutters with the marks they made on the wires found in all the bombs. Toolmark examiner Elizabeth Gillis.
When you have two tools that come off the production line one after the other, they're each going to have their own individuality, their own individual marks, so that when you do make a test cut with the tools, you can put them on the microscope and be able to differentiate between which tool made which mark.
First, Gillis cuts a piece of wire using the cutter she wants to test. The wire is the same type found in the evidence. Investigators must make dozens of cuts with the tool in order to study the angle, contact area, and other attributes of the cut. Only then can they match a wire with the tool that cut it. She places the test cut under a microscope, orienting it to the appropriate angle so that she can compare the test cut with the wire found in evidence. She then superimposes the two images to see if the two cut patterns match. In the case of Mike Stevens, investigators made a successful match. The wires used in all the bombs had been cut by the wire cutters found in the basement of Stevens' house. While the books, wires, and tools helped investigators tighten their grip on Mike Stevens, they still wanted one more piece of evidence. They needed to establish a connection between the explosives and the suspect.
People think that when a bomb goes off and blows up, that everything goes away. There's nothing further from the truth. When you have an explosion, all the explosive material is converted into a gaseous state that actually is consumed in the explosion. Well, that will go out as a heated gas, and when it hits other objects, it will cool down and start coating those objects, such as metal or clothing or wood or whatever. So not only will you have unreacted particles of explosives, but you'll have this gaseous film that's developed on other objects that you can test and get the residues from.
At the ATF lab in Rockville, Maryland, Doug Klapek analyzed residue from the bomb scene to determine the kind of explosive used. Once identified, Klapek tried to match it with evidence collected from Mike Stevens. The residue from explosives evaporates quickly, so samples of the debris were packed in airtight canisters. To test for explosive residue, Klapek had to capture it as it dissipated. He prepared a charcoal-filled pipette, which he then inserted into the top of the canister. The apparatus was then attached to a vacuum. As the canister was gently heated, air was drawn out through the pipette. The charcoal inside the pipette grabbed the chemical components from the evidence. These chemicals were analyzed to see what explosive they came from. The test confirmed that dynamite was the explosive used in these bombs. Next, Klapek had to prove that Stevens and Figley had recently handled dynamite. If they had, its residue would have remained on their clothes.
I found off of Stevens' boots and his clothes ethylene glycol dinitrate, which is only found in dynamite. There's no commercial use other than in dynamite for this material.
Investigators had made their case. They had matched Stevens and Figley to explosives and the tools used to make the bombs. Any missing details were sewn together by Earl Figley himself. With this evidence, ATF agents determined that Mike Stevens constructed 6 bombs in the Rochester hotel room with the help of Earl Figley. In fact, to shift blame from himself, Stevens made sure Figley played a significant role in the murders.
Mike Stevens was using Earl to do all his dirty work for him. And he was successful, I guess, for a few hours anyway, but not for very long.
Stevens' motive was vengeance. He was determined to make Brenda Shavir's family pay for rejecting him. To be certain the bombs were fatal, he loaded each with shrapnel.
There is no doubt in my mind that these devices were designed to kill somebody upon opening. They're a strictly booby-trap device addressed to a specific person.
In order to make the bombs harder to trace, Stevens stuffed the packages with newspapers from Buffalo, so it would appear the packages were sent from there, not from his home in Rochester. In court, Figley implicated Mike Stevens, then pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Convicted of the deaths of 5 people, Stevens was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. Most times, when a bomb detonates, it begins an agonizing catastrophe. But in a small town in Georgia, explosions are an everyday occurrence. Worldwide, the number of bombings is increasing every year. An alcohol, tobacco, and firearms study revealed that from 1990 to 1994, the number of reported bombings nearly doubled in the United States alone. Pete Maston, head of ATF training, has investigated explosions for more than 30 years.
Well, the typical bomber is perhaps the ultimate coward. The typical bomber doesn't face, nor do they want to face their opponent. They would much prefer to use whatever subterfuge and cover they can.
To make sure these criminals are brought to justice, the ATF brings young investigators and students to this testing ground in Brunswick, Georgia, to teach them how to catch a bomber. Here, the ATF trains evidence technicians, fire investigators, schematic artists, and explosives technicians. At the academy, each skill is refined by repetition. On this day, ATF bomb scene instructors will test their students' knowledge by detonating 3 car bombs, simulating real crime scenes. The men building and packaging these explosives are highly trained experts. Their job is as delicate as it is dangerous. One cannot underestimate the power of the explosive materials. That's why, in inexperienced hands, bomb-making information can be a recipe for disaster, as instructor Larry Casey explains.
all that information that's available doesn't have proper safety precautions in it, and the learning skills of sequential assembly processes, things that are important to know for safety reasons, are totally missing there. So they're always at great risk to blow themselves up. And we oftentimes will get a call and you'll find the tragic aftermath in a garage or someplace where the kids were doing experimentation, and what you get are pieces of bodies and tools scattered around, and death and destruction, and that's the sad part of this.
Instructors at the academy begin the training session by building pipe bombs. These bombs are not mock-ups, they are real. The explosive powder must be filled with great care. Just a few grains stuck in the pipe thread could trigger a blast. A small spark or even static electricity could ignite the powder. For the test, the bomb is placed so the end caps shoot into the engine compartment and the back seat, making the work of finding them more of a challenge for the students.
So that big high-pressure end cap should go right into that radio area.
So it's fore and aft kind of at this angle?
Yeah.
Okay.
When everyone has cleared the area, it's time for detonation. After the explosion, ATF investigators inspect the wreckage. Some of the lighter fragments were propelled hundreds of feet into the woods, creating a huge area to investigate. These fragments provide the students with valuable clues about the makeup of the bomb and where it was placed inside the car. In the field, nothing can be overlooked. Investigators have only one chance to gather evidence.
Once the scene is released, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible in some cases, to come back into that scene or to recreate that scene hours, days, or weeks later. So it's a one-shot opportunity for perfection.
Where'd you project the end caps going on this?
It quickly becomes evident how destructive these small pipe bombs can be. This explosion was so powerful that part of the cardboard carton pierced the car's steel door.
It's difficult to tell.
Smaller holes.
Other fragments sliced through the roof as if it were foil.
These holes are larger because the pieces didn't fragment as much.
Instructors prepare the next bomb by mixing several low explosives into one powerful cocktail. The work is nerve-wracking. The powder must be tamped into the pipe and the detonator delicately taped to the loaded bomb. In some cases, the seat cushions are wetted down to prevent fire from destroying evidence the students will need to work with. The final package is ready to detonate. After the explosions, the students divide into teams. The team leader assigns each person to a task.
Charlie, Ray, Rick, Frank, Joe. And Colin's going to kind of be the the overseer of that group. What you found, if you feel like you found something that's a really critical piece of evidence that's going to give us, particularly the guys that are on the car, to give them an idea on what the device is, to help them look more deeply into certain things, let's bring that up.
The students work together to investigate the bomb scene. In the field, ATF agents have to work quickly and under a great deal of pressure. Students are taught early on they will have to work with state and local authorities, laboratory technicians, and most importantly, each other to solve a crime. One team begins its work by forming a perimeter around the scene. Then they divide the area into quadrants before they begin their search for fragments.
Hey, Jim?
Just let him. Colin.
Here's your, this looks like the piece of the end cap, right?
The students walk along the tarmac, advancing as a team so they don't miss any shard of evidence. Each piece is then identified with a chalk circle or a small orange cone and assigned a number. In an explosive scene like this, evidence numbers can reach into the thousands. One team member records the identification number and exact location of each piece of evidence.
Roll for the interior too. Yeah, just stay with that.
Distances between the fragments are measured to plot their location.
16's right back.
So that you won't get
Another team closely inspects the damage inside the car. Their job is to figure out which fragments are part of the car and which may be parts of the bomb. For many of the students, this is the first time they have seen a bomb's devastation up close. It won't be their last. And while the damage to the car looks complete, valuable evidence remains embedded in the wreckage. Hatchets, hammers, and crowbars are brought in to pull these clues from the vehicle. The car is literally dissected as students search for pieces of the bomb lodged in or behind the dashboard. They never know where they might find the most significant piece of evidence. The students then move the car and search underneath. Bombs explode in all directions, and clues typically become embedded in the asphalt. Inspectors then sweep up what remains of the scene. The debris is then carefully sifted through a thin wire screen to separate any small clues that may have been overlooked. Instructors intensify the pressure and pump up the realism by adding a chaotic element to the bomb scene. They're called survivors. Role players portray panicked victims and family members whose loved ones have been killed or injured in the blast. The scenarios are built on actual occurrences. The students must learn to be firm but compassionate in the emotionally charged atmosphere. As the actors rush toward the bombed-out car, they're stopped by students who must be able to comfort them and keep them clear of the investigation. Once the scene is cleared, it is photographed and videotaped. Fragments are then collected and sent to a lab. These thorough investigation methods must be learned if the students ever hope to catch a bomber.
You've got to be able to prove your investigation in a court of law. And most of the time, that takes forensic evidence that puts the bomb in the hands of the bomber.
In the classroom, they get an anatomy lesson, learning the vital parts of a bomb. Tape, pipe, detonator, and wires are all carefully examined as the students begin to piece together the evidence gathered outside at the bombing scene. The need for well-trained ATF investigators is crucial for crime solving. Usually, when a bomb goes off, the bomber is miles away. But in a case in Florida, he struck frighteningly close to home. On July 9, 1985, two deafening explosions, seconds apart, rocked a quiet suburban neighborhood in Naples, Florida. The Collier County Sheriff's deputies immediately arrived at the scene. But the explosion had already taken the lives of two people. Matron of the wealthy Benson and Hedges tobacco family, Margaret Benson, and her adopted son Scott were killed. Margaret's daughter, Carol Lynn, was critically injured. The sheriff's office knew this type of devastation was no accident. They called the ATF for help. Special Agent Ralph Ostrowski worked the investigation.
In my 22 years with ATF, particularly my time in Cleveland, when I worked a lot of organized crime, bombings, vehicle bombings, this was without a doubt the worst vehicle bombing I had ever seen.
Ostrowski and his team immediately set out to discover what caused the destruction. Debris from the exploded Chevy Suburban was spread for yards around.
Oftentimes, especially in a bombing of this magnitude, debris can be spread hundreds of feet well beyond what you think it would be.
ATF agents worked with police to establish a procedure to conduct the evidence gathering. The agents had done this many times before, and they knew this case was going to take a lot of time to solve.
So by the second or third day, needless to say, the scene got to be very, very tedious to work. The agents were forced to wear masks because of the stench, and they did an excellent job in recovering as much of the evidence as they did recover.
Every fragment was marked. Chalk outlined where pieces of debris landed after the explosion. It didn't take long to discover the probable cause of the explosion. They found pieces of large metal pipes that weren't automobile parts. The ATF was confident the vehicle was destroyed by a powerful pipe bomb, but they now had to determine how it was constructed and who planted it.
The vehicle was absolutely destroyed. This was a large vehicle, a 1978 Chevy Suburban. The top of it was peeled back with two 27-pound pipe bombs in a contained vehicle. The force of the explosion did a great deal of damage.
B6.
As the evidence continued to accumulate, agents began questioning witnesses.
Like I said, I went ahead and...
The first person they spoke with was Stephen Benson, the only family member to escape injury.
Escorted them in the car.
His mother and his brother had been killed. His sister was fighting for her life in a hospital, yet police reported that Stephen Benson's demeanor was perfectly calm. even upbeat. This raised the suspicions of Collier County Captain Tom Storer.
My suspicions were aroused immediately that something is not right in what was going on. That it just wasn't consistent with a catastrophic event that had just occurred.
15:30.
Within 24 hours of the explosion, Stephen Benson stopped talking directly with police. All questions filtered through his attorney.
I'll contact you.
Though suspicious about Stephen Benson, investigators had to be careful not to jump to conclusions. So far, they had no solid evidence for or against Benson's involvement. It was too early in the game to launch accusations, and they had no time to waste following a false trail.
Okay, we'll be in touch with you. Okay, thank you.
We follow the evidence wherever that evidence is going to take us. If we focus on one subject and use all of our resources on that one subject and we happen to be wrong, then we've wasted very valuable time early on in the investigation when it's probably one of the most critical periods.
Back at the sheriff's office, investigators began to study all the evidence from the scene, including pieces of electronic circuitry and batteries, elements of a trigger device. They knew that whoever planted the bomb had some expertise in assembling electronics. Ralph Ostrowski and Jack Gant began to study a schematic artist's map of the explosion, giving them a clear look at the epicenter and direction of the blast.
The purpose of these sketches that we're looking at here today is to assist the investigator when he testifies in court. He'll be asked by the defense where each piece of these articles were picked up, and he must be able to testify that he picked these articles up in a location around the car. He must be able to provide testimony of what this article is. He must be able to tell the date and time he got it and identify it later, that this is the item that he picked up the particular day of the crime. Without that testimony, this evidence cannot be used in court.
The schematic shows where every speck of evidence was found after the blast. Their small size and great distance from the car are testament to the tremendous power of the explosion as it tore through the vehicle.
Margaret.
Once the maps were drawn and the evidence was collected, the investigation moved north. Fragments gathered at the scene were taken to the ATF laboratory in Atlanta, Georgia. Here, investigators would try to make sense of the twisted wreckage of the vehicle. Forensic chemist Walter Mitchell, a 26-year veteran of the ATF, started with a visual inspection of the fragments. Through the microscope, Mitchell studied the small wafer-like specks clinging to the sample. He tentatively identified the particles as smokeless powder. To confirm he was dealing with smokeless powder, Mitchell had to test it chemically using a process called thin layer chromatography. First, he coated a sheet of glass with an absorbent layer. Then he placed dots of the smokeless powder and his unknown sample on it. The glass was dipped into a tank of solvent. As the solvent was drawn up the absorbent layer, it carried with it small quantities of the dissolved powders. If the powders were the same, they'd migrate the same distance up the glass, forming streaks of identical length and color. Mitchell removed and dried it. Then he put the glass under ultraviolet light to compare the colors of the streaks. In this case, the color of the smokeless powder and the unknown sample matched. A comparison of the lengths of the streaks matched too. The test confirmed Mitchell's suspicions. Smokeless powder was used to blow up the vehicle in Naples, Florida. But scientists in the laboratory could not find any way to link the bomber to the bomb fragments. That evidence would have to come from somewhere else. In Naples, Florida, forensic investigators began to track down the origin of the metal pipe they believed housed the bombs that killed the Bensons. Pipe manufacturers stamp a maker's mark on their products. Fortunately, enough of the logos survived the blast to be identified. Agents traced the pipes to the only company in town that sold that brand.
About how recently?
A store employee told investigators that a few days earlier he had sold the pipes to a man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. The buyer said he worked for the Del Rey Construction Company. Investigators later found out that no such company existed. They took the invoices as evidence. The signatures were nothing more than a scribble, but the paper contained something more revealing. The invoices bore the impressions of a palm print. Could they be the link to the suspect, Stephen Benson? Authorities obtained Benson's own palm prints for comparison. They hoped to find enough points of identification between the two to make a match.
In this case, these palm prints that did come up on these forms are in excellent condition, and the points of identification probably reach near 60 to 75 points of ID. There's no question in anybody's mind that these palm prints are those of Stephen Benson. We have an item we'd like to show you that we...
A background check on Stephen Benson uncovered his fascination with explosives.
Belonged to a girlfriend of Stephen Benson.
In a high school yearbook, a dedication he wrote to an old girlfriend read, "I hope to see you this summer, then we can bomb around."
We had developed information that he started experimenting with explosives back many years ago in Pennsylvania. We had talked to witnesses that saw him with firecracker, M80, M100 type of devices, using copper tubing, using remote control to set off some of these firecrackers.
To understand Benson's possible motivation for murder, authorities looked to a financial auditor. The auditor determined that Benson, despite his access to a family fortune, was a terrible businessman. Police discovered that his financial failures were so far-ranging that Stephen started forging checks from his mother's accounts. When Margaret Benson discovered this, she threatened to write Stephen out of her will. Could it be Stephen Benson saw one clear way to get at those millions? Investigators believe Benson used his expertise in electronics to construct the two deadly bombs and the trigger device he used to set them off. On the morning of the bombing, Stephen told everyone he was going to pick up coffee and donuts. But police believe this is when he planted the bombs in the car. Once that was done, all he had to do was trigger the bombs, and a family fortune would be his. Or at least, that's what he planned. After Stephen placed the bombs under the car, he drove back home. He was gone approximately 45 minutes. Carol Lynn, Margaret, Scott, and Stephen set out to drive to the Gulf Coast to survey property for a new house. Carol Lynn reported that Stephen calmly walked side by side with the group, giving no indication of the tragedy he knew he was about to ignite. But as they were all about to get into the car, Carol Lynn noticed something was wrong.
Carol Lynn was able to tell us that the morning they got into the vehicle to leave, that things didn't look right at that point. She noticed that Scott was the driver. That was very rare that Scott was ever the driver. She noticed that Mother was in the front seat. Mother was seldom in the front seat, and that was her place because she got car sick a lot.
According to his plan, Stephen made sure everyone got into the car. Just before they were about to leave, Stephen excused himself to pick up something he'd forgotten. He disappeared inside the house. The investigation into the bombings uncovered the evidence needed to arrest and convict Stephen Benson. He was sentenced to life in prison. Bombs are built from common materials by people with an uncommon thirst for vengeance. Easily concealed, utterly devastating, a bomb can detonate anytime, anywhere. It's this simple truth that makes bombing so challenging to investigators and so chilling for the rest of us. But investigators have the advantage. When a bomber does strike, he always leaves his weapon at the scene of the crime. And with it is the residue of his guilt.